Barriers to entry. To explain why the world economies as of 2009 are not free markets in one sentence. Established firms lobby the state to make it more difficult for competing firms to establish themselves, and thus destroy competition. That is, they lobby the state to erect barriers to entry. Because populations believe in the legitimacy of the state, large firms, typically corporations, can buy off the legislators, the monarch or the dictator or whoever, and have them make laws favorable to their business at the expense of their competitors and or the general public. If companies tried to do these things themselves, they would be a near 100% marginal state. That is, nobody would view McDonald's decree that new fast food firms must pass inspections of McDonald's regulators as a legitimate imposition. And they would be fighting against McDonald's. But state regulators who are bought off by McDonald's are seen as legitimate, thus hijacking the ideological cloak of the state greatly lowers McDonald's cost of enforcement. Right? And so the state is, in effect, force multiplication for McDonald's. I have no crystal ball. Perhaps large firms would be able to create a marginal state within a stateless society, but I very much doubt this. And that is like herding cats, crushing slush, or pushing rope. Anyway, examples of barriers to entry. One example to barriers to entry would be increasing the fixed costs to start a firm. This can mean useless paperwork. Walmart, what they can do is they can hire guys who do nothing but fill out paperwork. And so if filling out paperwork costs Walmart $80,000 a year to hire a guy capable to do all that, it costs about the same for a mom and pop mart to do all that. But mom and pop mart is much smaller, and they can't afford to fill out all those papers, and so mom and pop mart goes belly up. By making it so each tiny firm has to pay as much as Walmart to do something, be it a fixed license fee, forms, whatever, that makes the smaller business less viable. And this doesn't have to be absolute. For example, it may cost Walmart $1 million to fill out forms and cost Mom and Pop Mart only $10,000 to fill out a form. But Walmart makes $360 billion a year, and Mom and Pop Mart only makes $500,000 a year. Thus, the costs of form filling disproportionately hurt smaller firms. Right? Even though Walmart is paying more for these regulations, as a percentage, they're paying less. So it actually, in terms of competition, it hurts smaller firms more, right? And so it prevents smaller firms from being able to compete with Walmart, and they thus go out of business while Walmart can stay. And so disproportionate cost of paperwork is why there has formed in America a seething web of difficulty, right? These paper prisons, courtesy of big business manipulating the fantasy structure of the state. A second form of barriers to entry would be tailoring regulations to match the specific setup of the lobbying firm. This way, the lobbyist doesn't have to change a thing, but his competitors are forced to change their production process. An example would be if car company A lowered toxic emissions by installing catalytic converters, while car company B lowered toxic emissions by having more efficient engines. And company A lobbied the state to require all cars to have catalytic converters installed. And this is exactly what happened. I forget what car company it was, but it was either GM or Ford on their latest model. To meet some new emission standards, they installed catalytic converters, the American company. Japanese companies did not have catalytic converters, but the Japanese cars did meet emission standards just because their engines were so much cleaner. Right? But the American company lobbied Congress to require catalytic converters on all these cars. So the Japanese cars, they had to take the cars back into the lines and had to retool them, and it cost the Japanese cars a bunch of money, and so their cars were more expensive on the American market, and so made the Japanese cars less competitive, right? And that's an example of lobbying the state to tailor regulations that match the specific setup of your firm, right? In this case, you have catalytic converters, the other company doesn't. therefore require all companies to have catalytic converters, makes your competitors do a little bit extra work than you have, and so you have a little bit of an advantage. Another form of barrier to entry would be to keep out foreign competitors, to keep American jobs. And what this does is it allows a cartel of firms in a given industry to lobby just one state and not have to worry about firms that don't fall under the hammer of the lobbied state. Right? They don't have to worry about firms coming from Canada or Japan or China or Germany coming in and competing. Right? They just have to worry about the firms in their arena. And so what they can do is they can, and like an example of this would be tariffs, right? Tariffs not only weaken foreign competitors and thus make cartelization within one state easier, and I'm using state in the political science term, not in terms like the 50 states of the Union. I'm talking about the United States as a state. And so tariffs not only weaken foreign competitors, but the lobbyists can use the excuse of a government revenue shortfall along with the Keep American Jobs line. However, without barriers within the state, external trade barriers won't prevent competition from forming within the borders of the state. So both internal and external barriers are needed for cartels to firm. And this is why you will often see big business championing labor, right? Keep American jobs. And what they really mean is raise those barriers to entry to foreign companies, right? And in 2009, this is why the British National Party gets a lot of big business support in Britain, because they want to keep out foreign competitive firms. Another barrier to entry would be to raise taxes on the, quote, rich, close quote. And the rich typically just means the up-and-coming rich, who earn about $1 million a year in 2009 dollars and threaten to break into the super-rich institutional wealth club. Okay? And this is why the super rich love to tax the rich, right? But the working rich are supposedly greedy and grasping. Of course, the super rich don't really pay any taxes because they don't earn any income, right? As it is classified, all of their expenses are paid by their company and are written off as business expenses. So a spike in the income tax doesn't hurt them at all. It only hurts the people who are likely to be their competitors in the future. So when some politician wants to tax the rich, ask if he's going to tax the Rockefellers, the Waltons, or the Morgans, or if he's just going to financially punish doctors and engineers for not providing enough net value to society. Right? Odds are they're not going to tax the super rich. They're going to tax the up-and-coming rich who pose a threat to the institutional rich. Barriers to entry are how cartels are maintained. In the old western territories of the United States, the railroad companies would routinely attempt to cartelize. That is, they would try to raise rates together. They have to raise rates together because if one rail line raised rates, they would lose all their customers to the other rail companies. So they would try to raise rates together, but this never worked. Right? They would raise rates, earn killer profits for a short period of time, right? But they're earning profits, and profits are a signal. And this attracts capitalists from other places to build competing rail lines to undercut the cartel, and the competing line will siphon off customers continually until the cartel breaks up. Thus, the rail lines had to lobby the state to get land grants, right? And these land grants were just that. They were grants of territorial monopoly that prevented other firms from building rail lines. Not related directly to cartelization, but I'm talking about railroads. The Transcontinental Railroad was built with land grants and subsidies. If rail was built over rough terrain and steep grades, the pay was higher than rail built on easy grades, and the result was that the rail companies tried to build rather circuitous routes on land that just barely qualified as rough grade, right? So they get the rough grade pay, right? And they'd have very circuitous routes, so they'd have a whole lot of track. And And so when you look at the rail lines, you'll see a picture of the Transcontinental Rail Line, especially when they're about to meet up, and it's really ridiculous. They're going through these hills and over around, and they're just winding all over the place, like trying not to meet up, trying to get like the last, government cheese before linking the rail lines, and the rail line was complete. That provides a visual description of what happens when firms are desensitized and not punished for wasting resources, right? All those status rail lines, they were all jagged and inefficient, right? And the transcontinental line, a lot of people don't know, actually went out of business, right? In contrast, James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad stretched from St. Paul to Seattle and was started in 1889 and completed in 1893 on a shoestring budget, but managed to turn a profit. Right, the lines were straight, built on low grades, and made from like imported Bessemer steel, which was like the highest quality steel of the time. And similar to the capitalists, skilled labor unions worked to keep out unskilled competition. Unions, professional associations, and guilds restrict entry into an industry, thus raising the value of each, for example, forklift operator, plumber, or candlestick maker. Right? Same with companies, same with capitalist firms, but on the labor side. This restriction in supply is in effect wasting resources because less people are willing to spend time getting through the guild, and thus we all have less of these people to benefit from. For example, the American Medical Association is a physician lobby group which lobbied to increase the number of years physicians had to spend in college and to shut down competitors such as homeopaths, pharmacists, midwives, nurses, and chiropractors. Okay, and one might claim that it was necessary to ensure quality physicians, but it wasn't patients who were clamoring for such things. Right? There's no reason to believe medical services cannot be produced and regulated in the same way that, say, microchips and jet aircraft are. And having various third-party testing and certifying agencies is not really a complex task. Just have third-party testing and certifying agencies for doctors, right, with watchdogs and watchdogs of the watchdogs and competing watchdogs calling each other out when their standards slacken. Right? Simple and predictable, not like the chaotic mess that comes from desensitized statist interventions. Minimum wages are also a barrier to entry that prevents competition against skilled labor from forming. That is, if you simply make it illegal to employ someone below a specified minimum wage, what that does is that restricts the labor market and forces employers to hire a few skilled laborers at $20 an hour instead of many unskilled laborers at $3 an hour, right? And this results in less efficient production and less actual stuff being available for society at large. And along with shutting out unskilled labor, the minimum wage increases the value of the skilled labor. Whereas if an employer had the option of employing some border brothers at $3 an hour, the skilled laborer may decide to work for $15 an hour because lower pay is better than no pay, right? You know, the skilled laborer may say, well, I want to work for $20 an hour, but I have these Mexicans to compete with and they're working for $3 an hour, so I need to cut my wages. So I need to, I'm willing to work for $15 an hour, right? And I can produce, 5 times as much as these Mexicans. And so I can, but because I can only produce 5 times as much, I can only command 5 times as much wages as these guys. Whereas if these Mexicans were not here, I'd be able to get $20 an hour. Okay, but with a minimum wage, right, shutting out this Mexican labor, the skilled laborer, instead of taking a wage at $15 an hour, can now take a wage at $20 an hour. See how that works? Anyway, that is just a quick rundown, and I recommended reading what is cited in this book if you are interested in more details. But all of these things use the state, and the state requires the belief. And the problem is that all of these tricks are somewhat hidden from view, right? Because most people, they see all these companies, they see all this advertising, and they see all these companies producing things with private property, and they go into stores and they buy things with money, and they say, this must be a free market. Okay? And that's why these regulations are so insidious, because they do great damage to the structure of production, causing great economic harm. Okay? They reduce economic mobility, they concentrate wealth in the hands of a few politically connected elite capitalists. And they're able to make it look like the problem is free enterprise. Okay, and these people they're just exploiting the fantasy structure of the state. And without that ideological cloak, the capitalist would have to compete fair and square. Barriers to entry and hierarchy in firms. If we recognize that 1, new industries require more planning than old settled industries, and 2, capitalists plan the structure of production, then we know that new industries will tend to have more capitalists, and older industries will tend to have less capitalists. And I'm being redundant here, but this is important. If the capitalists can get to the politicians, however, they can cartelize, and this cartelizing raises their profits, resulting in them not being phased out like they would be on a free market. So a free market would be a much more social market, and capitalists have their place. They are not good or bad per se, nor is hierarchy good or bad per se, and I do not foresee many completely non-hierarchical firms. Hierarchy is something that will always exist on a continuum and will flare in and out as new technology is implemented. As you have new technology, you have a new industry, and that requires more planning, which will require more capitalists, which will result in more hierarchy. But as this industry becomes settled and there's less planning that is needed, the less money is spent on planning. And so the less money spent on capitalists, and so the firms have less capitalists.